Sometimes something just sounds like it needs investigating, like when one of the world's finest microphone manufacturers turns their hand to headphones. And I say that in the plural sense because there's not one but 4 new models, all closed back, all low impedance, all very fairly priced, but there's something very familiar about this. There's 4 variations in the Audix headphone lineup, starting with the A140, and that's a 40mm driver version. There's also the A142, which is an extended bass version of the same. You've then got the A150 and the A152, which again are the same, but in 50mm drivers. Now remember that thing about familiarity? There's something very familiar about this. Audix, Stephen Slate Vsx. Audix, Stephen Slate Vsx. They are the same headphone design. Or rather, the external is, apart from the fact that Stephen Slate has got some kind of coloured fleck rainbow effect into the plastic, and the Audix have gone for just plain plastic. The pads and the cables on the Audix are both better than Vsx in that they are thicker and the pads are just a bit more comfortable and they're finished properly, which was one of my main gripes about the Vsx ones. But are they the same driver? Well, there's only one way to find out, and that's to stick them onto the mini DSP ears rig that I've got here and have a look. Now, I know this isn't the most accurate test rig, but it will easily show us the comparative difference between the 2 models pretty accurately. So let's go and have a look. Okay, so let's open up Roomy Q Wizard that I've measured the headphones in, and let's first remind ourselves what a decent headphone response looks like on this chart. So here's the Audix LCD2, and you can see here that we've got a very even line going down, and you know, you've kind of got this dip area here, but other than that, and that's quite common in the sort of the presence region of headphones, that you do get a dip around about that sort of 3 to 5K region. But here we go. It's pretty even going up, you know, very good tilt on it. This is very similar to the kind of room tilt that you would get in a studio. It's the fact that many places don't have flat response. What you want is even response with a slight tilt to the bass. With closed back models, you tend to find that you get a bit of a tilt in the bass, and then when you get into the mid-range, it kind of flattens off. And that's the kind of response that we tend to see in a closed back. So let's now swap over onto the Audix, and here's the 150. So this should be their flagship model. There's also the 152, which is the bass enhanced version. And you can see there, it's very similar, but obviously lifting up in the bass region here. Personally, when we look at this, you've kind of got this fairly even. And again, remember, each one of these blocks is 2 dB. So it's actually quite a tight curve in here. So we're fairly even up to about 170. Then we've got this dip, and then it kind of comes out and then drops off a little bit in the upper mid. And then you've got this 10K peak, and then again it drops off. Now this is quite common for closed back headphones. They normally have some form of dip sort of above 12K, and hey, I'm over 40 and I can't hear it anyway. There's the difference between the 150 and the 152. But actually the question was that we did have, they appear very similar to Slate Vsx. But how similar are they? So this is the raw Vsx headphone, And we can see, actually, there's a lot of similarities here, but I can tell you there's a lot of differences as well. So it's conclusively not the same driver. You can see we've got very similar characteristics, but again, this is all down to the fact that it's sharing the same enclosure. So much of this is down to design. You've got this dip, you've got the peak, you've got a little dip here. And then you can see actually there's quite a bit of a difference in the upper mid region, especially this spike. What's that, 5K or so? So a lot of this design is down to the physicality of the headphone, and as you can see, a lot of it is down to having a different driver. What I then looked at is how can we actually even that out? Because the top end here is probably a bit low for my liking. It just dips too much. And there's, of course, this sort of dip at 300 hertz where we definitely want to have a look at that. Now let's see what we can do to make this all a little bit tighter. So I've loaded up FabFilter Pro Q3, and if I pop up on the Room EQ Wizard the graph of before and the graph of after, you can see that we've managed to flatten off the bottom end response. That tails off very slightly into the mid-range. There's still a little bit of a dip here, but again, it's part and parcel of the headphone shell design. That goes pretty smoothly across to the upper mid-range, and we've managed to bring that up. You'll see you can't cancel all of these nulls out. That's incredibly hard to do. And in fact, that's, if you try and concentrate on that, it sounds artificial because you're fighting against the headphone. But what we can do is just try and bring the difference between the mid-range and the upper mid-range up a little bit, and then even out this 10K spike, which then brings up the region sort of between 12 to 14K that people can still hear. That's kind of what we've done, and we've done it with a variety of EQ points here on FabFilter Pro Q3. Again, I love FabFilter for this. It's one of the best EQs you can use to do headphone alterations, and I'm running in natural phase mode. So it's fairly low latency, but it just has a lovely characteristic, and it doesn't really seem to generate artifacts and pre-ringing and all the other stuff. It's a very good way of working. So with that, you can see what we've managed to do. However, actually, it would seem that the 152 seems to take EQ slightly better. So there's what we started with it. And that's what I've ended up with, because it's just a bit easier to take down stuff in big sweeping motions. And that is an absolutely lovely curve. You can see here that we're fairly even. We've still got the bass tilt on it like you would with Studio House curve. But the top end is fairly even, and then it's, you know, we're increasing some of that very high frequency material there. So it would seem that the 152 is a much better headphone to work with when you're EQing. So both of these share the same 50mm driver. But what about the smaller ones? Now, unfortunately, we have only got one of those, and it is the 140. But let's bring the graph up for that. Well, there's the frequency response chart with the 140, and you can see, actually, it's fairly different to the others. There's some characteristic things that stay the same. So if I pop up the 150 with it, you'll see we've still got a dip here. We've still got a dip there, but they've moved very slightly. It's still following the same sort of line, and we're still getting the same sort of drop-off region here in the upper mid, but it's not quite as pronounced. And actually, tonally, it's just a lot more even straight off the bat. So this is with no EQ on whatsoever. And it's really not bad. If we take this sort of 82 dB point here in the middle as the sort of the median, then we're going up, 30 hertz is only up to 85 where it's peaking, and down to 78 and kind of 77 in that mid-range bit. But this is incredibly even for a close back. Normally, we'll have much larger chasms in the frequency response as it's going back. All of these Audix headphones have got a very, very even frequency response for a close back. So let's put this slightly into context and show you one that many people on YouTube have, especially when I was doing the Dan Clark Audio Eon 2 closeback review, came up and said, actually, the Austrian Audio X55 is a fantastic headphone, and you really don't need any better than it. Well, let's pop that up on the graph. There we go. So the Austrian Audio X55, designed, of course, by the ex-AKG headphone engineers. Okay. Well, yeah, that's a veritable mountain range. And that's very similar to most popular close-back models. It's very similar sort of movement and range that you'll get. So you can see there actually how good the Audix is in comparison to that. Now, what happens if we then go and EQ that? So if I pop up my Audix A140 EQ, and it really hasn't taken a lot. There's no huge big cuts and peaks in it. And then turn on that. You will see we've really managed to flatten this out. So again, lovely tilt down on the bottom end, incredibly even on the mid-range, and then across to the upper mid and the treble, and it does just sort of maintain that and dip down a bit. This would seem like it's probably about the best that you're going to get. But again, real life taking over, and the fact, of course, that I'm over 40 means that if we look on Pro Q3, there's this top 10K, 9.8K cut. Either take back that off or just turn it off. Actually, with it off, it was probably the more pleasurable one to my ear, but it could just be that because of my age, I'm really craving that crisp top end. Certainly, this is an amazing headphone when EQ'd for giving us that very even tonal balance in a close back. Now, of course, with any of these, we should be using a Crossfeed plugin to give you the best translation. So something like Canopener Studio from Goodhertz. Personally, I'm using this in the Hyperrealistic mode, and to compensate for the change that it does in Hyperrealistic mode to the mid-range, you do need to add in 2 EQ points. So here, 1100 Hertz, 1.5 dB with a Q of 1, and 700 Hertz, 0.8 dB with a Q of 1. This won't completely cancel out the difference that it makes, but it just brings that mid-range back up. Now, this is a natural effect of sort of cancellation that you would get off speakers, but actually when you're mixing on headphones, it just seems to sap the snare out of the mix and make things more difficult than they need to be. I would totally encourage you to have a go with those settings, which are kind of, they're actually both a dB down to what it actually does and makes a change. So if you are going to use Canopener, have a look at those 2 extra EQ points. Again, this raises the question of what is the better headphone? Well, certainly the larger diaphragm does have a bit more separation in the top end, but after you've put all of the extra EQing and the crossfeed on, actually the 140 just seems a little bit more punchy and responsive to me. And the final tone that I get and the balance is probably better on, in fact, it's definitely better on the 140 than the bigger headphones after you've put the crossfeed and the EQ on. Now, the frequency response charts only tell us half of the story. The other half, of course, is detail level and sort of waveform reproduction accuracy. So how accurately does the headphone reproduce what's coming out of the amplifier? Well, in this case, unfortunately, that is where this does fall down, and it's completely what I would expect at this price point. It's certainly not an Audix LCD XC or a Focal Elegia hiding inside here. It sounds like the detail level that I would expect. So there's no super fast transients, but what you do get is a lovely balanced sound. And actually, I think to that extent, the A140 model is my pick of the bunch. Without having to put some EQ on it, it's got a really good even tonal balance. With the little tweak that I showed you, it's great. However, it's only part of the story. If you really do want to be hearing more detail than your speakers and stuff, you do need to start looking to that next generation of headphones. So the Audix Penrose, the LCD One, basically most of the planar type drivers, or the high-end Focals, Rad Zeros, headphones, that, all of the normal characters that we do talk about. But this shouldn't get mixed up with that because it's a closeback. As I said in the Penrose review, closebacks are extremely hard to get even because of the reflection off the back of the cup. You normally get a substantial dip at some point in the frequency response, and with this, it just didn't happen. It's incredibly well balanced, and I can totally see why Audix would do this range. Yes, there's a little bit more sort of treble separation and definition with the bigger driver, but honestly, the A140 is my absolute pick of the bunch, because for what you need, you're not spending more money than you need to, and it's just a very even headphone to balance things with. I personally wouldn't pick this as my only headphone, but if my budget was 150 quid and I needed a closed back pair, I would take this above the Buyers, above the Audio-Technica M50, M70. It's streets ahead in the actual balance of what it can do, and that is, half of the battle, more than half the battle. But the A140 is an outstanding closed back, lightweight, easy to drive studio headphone that, if £150 is your budget, this is exactly where you should be looking. There are a couple of downsides to it. Firstly, like any closed back headphone, it's very dependent on getting the positioning and the seal right. Even with the world's biggest head, found that I needed to reduce the size on the headband slightly and just make sure it was properly tied in and it had a good seal around my ears. I also did see a very slight difference when taking my glasses off. Surprisingly not in the seal and the low frequencies, but in the higher frequencies and just the position of it driving into my ear. I also found that the 40mm driver version, the A140, was better for this positioning than the larger one. That was a lot more harder to really get into the ideal position and just get everything lovely and balanced. This one's a little bit easier, and it's not wrong with the glasses on, but definitely if you're not a glasses wearer, you'll find this a lot easier to do. So that's it. A140 Audix, outstanding, my absolute pick of a great value, easy to drive, closed back headphone that's got an incredible even tonal balance. And I think this is totally something that you should look for if you've got a £150 budget and you absolutely need a closed back. Although the frequency balance is as good as an open back. Yep, surprised, so am I. If you've got any comments, we'd love to hear them. Otherwise, we'll see you for another video again soon.